Good morning.
Morning.
That's better. Welcome to this last event of the Presidential Climate Commission at the COP27. We are talking this morning about tracking progress towards a just transition. Let me say that South Africa is a leader in the area of just transition. And in 2015, we were the only country actually that had just transition in our NDC submission. By 2020, there were 32 other countries that had just transition in their submissions. So I'm not claiming the spot, it is true. The other thing, South Africa is also a leader in monitoring and tracking progress in the area of climate change. For example, we have a monitoring and evaluation system that is quite mature in the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment that monitors greenhouse gas emissions over time and against our commitments that we have made as a country in this area. We have a just transition framework that has been approved by Cabinet and has been developed by the Presidential Climate Change Commission, which is basically the blueprint and agreement that we have made as South Africans in terms of the route that we want to take in achieving a just transition in the Republic. We therefore want to track all action that we are conducting in the Republic towards the just transition. Emission reduction, of course, being one of them, and all other climate action that is taking us to the just transition future that we want. I have this morning a very esteemed panel, and maybe let me start by introducing myself. My name is Thuli Khumalo. I'm the Chief Operations Officer at the Presidential Climate Commission Secretariat. I have with me Ms. Katie Ross. You can just wave a hand so they see which one is Katie. And she is the content manager at the PCC. And I have Zira Huaje, I hope I'm pronouncing your name well, who is the focal person, Nigerian focal person at the African Climate Foundation. And Ms. Makoma Lekalakala, who is a commissioner in the PCC and also a director at Life South Africa. And I have Thando Lwetu, who is a coordinator at SACAN. Lastly, but not least, Brandon, who is a climate advocacy lawyer at the Center for Environmental Rights. Thank you so much for coming to listen to this session. Let me at this stage not waste time. I welcome you. We have a virtual audience that at this stage, I hope they are connected and they are seeing the event live. And yes, let me hand over to Katie to kick off the discussion with the presentation, and then we will have the panel make verbal remarks, after which we will take questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Over to you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Thuli, and it's a pleasure to see you all this morning. Thank you very much for coming. It's a very crowded space. There's a lot of chatter and talking this COP. So I appreciate you making the time to talk about what we see as very fundamental to a just transition and the climate change response, is really making sure that we have effective and robust monitoring and evaluation systems set in place that embody inclusive and participatory processes to help track the transition. So as Thuli said, I am with the Presidential Climate Commission. We are doing some emerging thinking about what it means to track a just transition. This is a fairly new topic. Just transitions generally is kind of much more nascent than other climate and development policy spheres. And with this emerging focus on a just transition, it becomes really important to think about how we're going to actually track the transition. As Thuli said, the Presidential Climate Commission was established by the President of South Africa back in December 2020. Our primary objective is to oversee and facilitate a just transition in the country. I'd like to say we've been very instrumental in supporting the government of South Africa in putting forward more ambitious climate commitments through the NDC, which gave rise to this very historic Just Energy Transition Partnership Package, which was agreed to at COP26 last year. The commissioners include government ministers as well as senior members of all stakeholder groups in South Africa. This is really embodying the social compacting approach that South Africa gets things done with, right? We have to bring different stakeholders around to forge consensus on some quite difficult issues. And very thrilled we have Makoma here as well, who represents a very strong community activism voice in the Commission. And where we sit, we're in the Secretariat that is doing a lot of the day-to-day thinking and running of the Commission. Per the mandate that's set out in the draft climate change bill in South Africa, the Presidential Climate Commission is intended to play a very important role in monitoring and evaluating government's response to climate change. So if you advance one more slide, what we're going to be talking about today is there are these three objectives in the draft climate change bill for the Presidential Climate Commission. This third one here is monitoring and evaluating progress towards government's emission reduction and adaptation goals. And intrinsic to that is how just is this response going to be? There's a lot of literature around the importance of monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation can just be monitoring and cannot lead to any change. And we're really trying to get out of the setup where we're just tracking for the sake of tracking. We're really focused on what will make effective tracking of a just transition. And if we're getting this job done well, we're going to be providing a clear understanding of the progress that's been made to tackle climate change in South Africa, the progress that's been made on a just transition. And then there's going to be important feedback loops here. So how can the results of the monitoring exercise actually helpfully inform policy direction? We know that transparency is key in the international negotiations. There's this enhanced transparency framework. And then we also find transparency incredibly important, both within the how the PCC operates and also how it reports on information about climate change. And we're intending to really provide a broader view of progress on the just transition, complementing the efforts that are already underway. As Thuli mentioned, South Africa is really a leader in the developing world, in particular on monitoring and evaluation. Formerly, monitoring and evaluation was put into national climate change policy back in 2011. It did have an initial mitigation thrust, but that system was then expanded to encompass financial and adaptation aspects in 2015. Domestically, we've been publishing several reports from the government on South Africa's climate change response, and we're also pretty having a leading role in submitting what we call biennial update reports to the UNFCCC, and South Africa's already submitted 4, which makes it one of the top developing countries in terms of the international climate change response. So as I mentioned when I was starting today, the just transition approach is really new. I mean, it kind of evolved out of North America in the 1970s, but that was predominantly focused on the labor movement. And we've really got to a point where there's broad consensus that a just transition requires a whole of society approach. It affects the whole of the economy. And because this thinking around the just transition is quite new, countries are really up to their own to define what a just transition looks like for themselves. We in South Africa have just developed a just transition framework adopted by Cabinet, which is built on years of work in really coalescing what a vision for a just transition means in South Africa. So while the vision for a just transition is emerging, it becomes equally important to track progress towards those objectives. So how are we thinking about the principles for tracking a just transition in South Africa? We know that it should complement and build on the existing systems in South Africa. It's got to support the existing work that's being done in tracking by government and also by business. There needs to be a strong focus on the evaluation of the M&E, right? So making sure that we have these strong feedback loops to affect policy change. We've got to be looking at a lot of aspects of the just transition. So the just transition is really broad, and I'm going to go into a few examples of this, but it's not just tracking GHG outcomes. We're really thinking about tracking the impacts of people's lives and livelihoods, and that requires information at a very granular level. I'm so thrilled that we have such wonderful representatives of the panel who can really bring the strong community voice and the strong youth voice. But there is a real demand within the Presidential Climate Commission around this concept of procedural justice. So making sure that impacted people are involved and have a voice in defining the futures that they want. And that also comes into the process of tracking the just transition. And it comes to this final point, and these are actually fairly new acronyms to me, CREAM and SPICED. I know we're all working on SMART indicators, which typically have this sort of very measurement focus. But what I quite like about this CREAM and SPICED approach, and I hope you can take that away with you, is the CREAM focuses on tracking elements for adequacy. So we need to be tracking both qualitative and quantitative aspects of the transition. You know, how decent are the jobs being created? These are not necessarily readily lending themselves to quantitative metrics. So we need to be able to be tracking the qualitative aspects of the transition. And then our colleagues at Groundworks introduced us to SPICED. And the thrust of the SPICED is the S being subjective and the P being participatory. So this is really bringing the community voice into how we think about tracking a just transition. How do they define a just transition? What indicators are important to them? And how can we involve those communities in actually surveying what the impacts are of the just transition? What does it actually feel like at a very community level on the transition? Thank you. And as I was saying, the just transition is very, very broad, and we could be tracking a number of aspects around it. There are the justice aspects, the procedural justice aspect, how are communities involved, how are impacted populations involved, the distributive justice aspect, you know, how are we distributing the challenges and the costs of the transition, and the restorative aspect, particularly important in South Africa, how are we going about remedying past harms. The just transition impacts also large. Our just transition framework speaks to the significant policy interventions that need to be implemented to give effect to a just transition. This is about reorienting financial flows. It's about putting in place effective governance arrangements. We've got to reorient the way we think about social support. How do we spur economic diversification, industrial development? All of these changes that need to be happening, they also need to be tracked. And the just transition happens at the local level. You know, these national systems are not going to be readily applicable to tracking a just transition. If you go to a community in Mpumalanga and say, well, there are several 100,000 net jobs as a result of the transition. Well, when they're losing their job, that doesn't mean much to them. So we've got to be thinking about tracking a just transition at a very local level and tracking it by a variety of facets there as well. And just in conclusion on how we're thinking about our future directions of work in South Africa, the message I'll underscore is we're really keen to work with all and collaborate. This is what the Presidential Climate Commission is about. It's about facilitating open and transparent processes, bringing views around the table. And I think this has been incredibly successful in the work we have done so far, and it's how we want to approach our monitoring and evaluation work. So this key about broad social consensus and defining a framework to track a just transition, and also complementing the significant work we have already underway. We are intending to publish a biennial State of Climate Action report in South Africa, really answering the question, how goes the battle? How are we actually doing on these facets of mitigation, adaptation, finance, and the just transition? And also working very closely with the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation to ensure that the just transition imperative is embodied in government's development plans, and also in the annual performance plans of various government departments and minister KPIs. So with that, I'll close. I'm really excited for this fabulous panel that we have assembled today with very different perspectives. We can dive in a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. At this point, I would like to turn to the panel, and you have 5 minutes to answer my question and make additional remarks. And afterwards, we will then take questions from the floor and from the online audience. I will start with you, Zira. My first question to you is, how is Nigeria approaching the just transition? And what, in your view, are the key dimensions of the transition that need to be tracked in order to effect change?
Thank you very much. And that was a really great presentation, Katie. Thanks for setting the context. So I represent ACF in Nigeria, and we're really grateful to the support of the PCC and other stakeholders in South Africa for sharing lessons to Nigeria as we developed our own just transition package over the past year. So Nigeria's journey on energy transition has had ups and downs, but I think over the past 2 years, we've seen good policy progress. We saw the energy transition plan that was launched at COP26. And then shortly after that, the government signed into law Climate Change Act that was modeled after the UK Climate Change Act. So that act provides for, the setup of a council, which looks similar to what the PCC is. And that council has been inaugurated by the president, so it's up and running this year. So that's on the policy side. But with, just transition, it's really important to talk about how to translate that policy into action. And I think that's where data accountability really comes into play. In the case of Nigeria, the ETP is still at an early stage of implementation. I think South Africa is much farther ahead. The milestones and some of the targets haven't really been broken down into granular bits yet. But the plan is that with the council being set up, the council is responsible for developing a national action plan, which has along with the action plan, a monitoring and evaluation framework. So at this stage, it's still in text, it's still in legislation, but the work that we are trying to do, at least stakeholders like me, is to push that forward and get it implemented. But I would like to share 2 main lessons to answer the second part of the question, on Nigeria's progress so far. The first is on the importance of data, models, and pathways. So after the energy transition plan was developed, we realized that there was a significant gap in terms of our understanding of pathways that are economically and politically viable. And without developing those pathways, it's really hard to inform policy decisions that would then translate into action. So I would really prioritize that for like other countries that might be thinking about designing just energy transition packages, because without the foundational data, it's really difficult to move things forward. Then the second lesson, I think from the past year that I'll share, is on the fixation on financing. South Africa got 8.5 billion, or that was the narrative at COP26. And then Nigeria wanted to get 10 billion, Indonesia 20 billion. Every country wanted to outdo each other. And that fixation on financing, I think, distracted the energy transition team from really looking at other areas to unlock investments. We're thinking about it as the finance was the outcome. So if we can raise $10 billion from development partners by COP27, then that's goal achieved. But I think a better way to look at it was, what do we need to do to attract investment? And what are the specific policy steps that we need to take, and then we track that as we go along. So that's something that we are rethinking in terms of our approach, because there are several issues around the business environment that need to be fixed. And the issue about fixation on finance also basically takes away attention from some of the underlying issues that are unresolved. So I'll stop here for now, and happy to discuss in more details in specific aspects.
Thank you very much, Zira. Let me turn to you, Sasmakoma. In your experience as an activist, how have coalitions and communities been able to come together and drive change? And what are the essential ingredients for that to happen? And how can these lessons be shared and transferred into our work on the just transition?
Thank you very much. Communities have been part of shaping the transition based on their lived experiences. What drives communities to be part of this path towards a just transition. It's for them to be able to improve their lives and also improve their health, but also thinking about the future generation. At home in South Africa, there's a number of coalitions networks that are working around climate change mitigation and also that are involved in adaptation measures at the local level. And I'm just going to highlight the work of a coalition called the Life After Coal Coalition Network, which is comprised of Earthlife Africa, Groundwork, Friends of the Earth South Africa, and the Center for Environmental Rights. In the past years, we are working with communities, various communities in South Africa, particularly those that are in hotspot areas. And we came together with the communities because they were raising issues as to how can we move towards a low carbon development, what are the mitigating factors, and what should be our involvement or our participation. And I'm comfortable to say that today, with the Just Transition Framework that was produced by the Presidential Climate Change Commission, most of those communities, activists were part of the consultations and they have contributed to what we have today. But then we produced an open agenda on the just transition that is a continuous discussion and debate amongst ourselves, pending on the observations and also what actions are being taken to improve our lives. But in that open agenda, it's driven by principles of involvement and inclusivity, open discussion, and also debate and democratic decision-making. At the center of this open agenda on the just transition, it's climate justice and also gender justice, because we understand that gender is a cross-cutting issue and must be incorporated in all aspects of the just transition. And we've seen that it comes out clearly in the framework that gender is one of the issues that should be taken into consideration. But we're not just saying gender, we also have to make sure that processes that take place, they include also people, women, and people who are a part of the LGBTQI community. And we've seen the active participation, particularly there were more women, if we can make it data, in all the community consultations that the PCC had. And so that's why this document reflects a very strong gender and climate justice issue. What also is very important is that this is a continuous agenda, and on the implementation of the framework, this is where, because of the open agenda aspects, this is where we're going to see more communities being involved, more communities wanting to know what's happening. And I think currently the sole issue now is how communities can be involved in the just energy partnership investment plans that are there. And I think it's very crucial that ordinary people, members of the community, are part of that. Transparency is very important. Open democratic decision making is very important. And if we continue with this line, this is where we'll see the success of the transition, because it will be owned by all South Africans, it will be owned by communities, and also the multi-sectoral debates and discussions that should take place at a local level are important amongst communities, businesses, and other institutions, so that we can see the success of moving towards a low carbon development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Makoma. At this point, I'll turn to the youth. Thandolwethu, representing the youth. From your perspective as a youth leader, what role should the youth be playing in holding business, government, and labor accountable to the commitments in the just transition?
Thank you, Tuli. If it's okay, I just want to quickly touch on some work that we've done on the subject over the last year, and then I'll respond to your question. So in 2021, we participate, together with SAMIA, South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association, and some other colleagues from various government departments, we set up a hackathon, which looked at developing 2 guidelines, specifically the climate and ecosystems health guideline, and then a transformational equity guideline. The 2 guidelines are intended to inform specifically the subject of how do we move then from where we currently are, both in terms of what climate change, climate change challenges that we face, but also the transformational challenges that South Africa has, specifically some of the equity issues. And so in this process, we then involved quite critically as well with DPME to try and see how we could develop guidelines and how they might feed into the guidelines that DPME is currently using to monitor and evaluate their programs. So some guiding principles have been around the issues of equality and justice, as mentioned by Mama Goma here, the principles of Ubuntu, inclusivity, systems thinking, just so that it takes a more holistic approach to how it is that we might respond to the issues that face us. So if I could quickly zone in on the first one, which is climate and ecosystems health, we know that climate change is obviously bringing actual changes to the environment. So the questions around the ecosystems health speak to the issues of how, when we're looking at the changing environment, how might we consider then if water is going to impact it, and we're talking about just transition, and we know we're going to be needing water resources, how can we put in place in the designing of these programs the necessary metrics to be able to measure how improvements have taken place in that specific area, how we might be able to then over the longer term or medium to long term look at mitigating options when we look at the evaluation process that we can then incorporate into a longer term thinking. So we it speaks to issues around when we're designing specifically the interventions, for instance, this one on the JET-P, how can we bring in the monitoring and evaluation aspects close to the design process, so that when we're looking at the evaluation at a later stage, we already know what we're going to be tracking. So throughout this process, you're already looking at some of these different metrics, so that at least at the end, when you're evaluating, it speaks directly to the issues that we had identified, and we'll be able to see whether or not we've been able to hit the mark, as it were. Similarly, when we look at the issues around transformation and equity, we live in a society that is obviously quite highly unequal. There's issues like unemployment and so on. So also when we're designing interventions, how then do we address some of these issues, particularly the justice components? And so, the issues around transformational equity look at the who, the what, the where, the how. These interventions that we're going to be talking about are going to impact both those who are going to be delivering the interventions, but also for those who are going to be the beneficiaries of said interventions. And so to achieve this, we've been engaging quite a bit with the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. They have actually pretty much agreed to the guidelines that we've had them. They've actually been absorbed as part of the guideline system of South Africa and DPME. So the next phase then for us is then how then can it link to the work that's going to be done, for instance, on the JET-P and the implementation on the JET-P. We know that it's about to move into that phase. So then to answer the question around then youth participation specifically, as Umama Gomo was saying, it's important that all stakeholders are involved, including the youth. Now, one of the things that the youth has been able to do is to really be thinking ahead around how they might be the leaders in the future of some of these spaces, how the interventions that we're going to be planning, the level of ownership that they're going to be taking in some of these spaces, how they might be contributors to the interventions themselves, because it can't just be that you're going to be on the outside and expect that you can want to scream from the outside what should be done. So it's looking at active participation of the youth in the actual implementation of some of these activities. And then of course, the issue of accountability and transparency are also always very important. So when we look at this, both from the monitoring and evaluation and tracking process, the better we're able to design and the better we're able, in my view at least, to insert some of these metrics from the design phase. When we're looking at the implementation and then later the evaluation phase, it becomes easier just to see whether or not, as I said, we're able to meet our targets or not in the implementation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Thandi. I have a very good panel. Everybody's sticking to time. Let me just warn you, MEC, I have a question for you too, to contribute to this conversation. I'm telling you so that you start preparing yourself. I'll be asking you about how you think provinces can participate in the monitoring of the just transition at their level and reporting on that. So I think 5 minutes is enough time for an MEC to prepare. Brendan, let me turn to you. The Center for Environmental Rights have long championed issues of environmental rights for disadvantaged communities and communities in general. And why and how should communities be involved in tracking the just transition? That's your first question. The next one is, you're the tallest member of the panel, you pay for it. The next one is talking a bit about the climate change bill and the provision it makes around the provision of information and suitability to enable statutory basis for effective tracking, monitoring, and evaluation of climate change response. So it's 2 easy questions for you. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tuli. Hi, everyone. I must say at the outset, I find this to be a very exciting and creative process, and I think holds a lot of promise for us to do things differently to how they've been done in the past. We have indeed been working with frontline and at-risk communities for over 12 years, litigating and advocating in rights abuse cases. A lot of that work has been around air pollution and mining, and obviously in more recent years been going into the climate space a lot more. And one of the fundamental hallmarks of this work has been a lack of transparency, access to information, and flowing from that, a lack of participation and consultation. Sometimes that is because the information has been disorganized or logistically made not easily accessible, but quite often it's been because we have polluters and certain regulators that attempt to evade responsibility. We have had to undertake dozens of PIRE requests over the years. Just yesterday, I had some colleagues in the High Court that were trying to compel the Energy Ministry to release records on why it wants to build new coal-fired power, something that it should have done in terms of law. And we cannot see this culture of withholding information being perpetuated when it comes to the just transition. The just transition, for it to work, is going to need to build an incredible amount of trust to make sure that people feel comfortable that they are not being left behind, that there is the necessary political will and institutional commitment to do so. In terms of being able to track effectively, obviously one needs to decide what information is going to be monitored to start off with. And I think this type of information, all of it needs to be looked through the lenses of the 3 dimensions of justice: procedural, distributive, and restorative. So we do need to see good information around employment, what jobs are outgoing, what jobs are incoming, what reskilling is happening, where opportunities lie. Very important to track community well-being, such as energy security and affordability, health, human health, as well as ecosystem health, and economic health. How are SMMEs going to be faring in the just transition, and where do the opportunities lie? Very important to follow the money, so tracking the financing, where's it coming from, what do the budgets look like, where's it going to, and what are the terms and conditions. And then obviously the conventional climate response indicators as well: emissions reduction, how are we doing as a country, how are we doing across sectors. We need to know what carbon budgets are being allocated, how the compliance levels are, what exemptions might be in place, very importantly. On the adaptation side, also need to have indicators around what adaptation plans have been submitted, what scenarios they're based on. And this is very important at a municipal level, because that's where the front line of climate adaptation takes place. So people need to be able to evaluate how effective those adaptation plans are. And also looking at the resilience of infrastructure. What is the progress looking like with that? And I mean, these are some ideas that we've gleaned from work with communities, but it's critically important that communities and people have input into what these indicators are. We need to move from the situation where the interventions that are meant to benefit people are done to them, and they need to participate in that. Once that data has been determined, then obviously the tracking can happen, the monitoring can happen, and very importantly, it must be published, and it must be digestible, accessible, supported with fact sheets, explainers, translated into all appropriate languages. And then people can discern for themselves. Is this successful? Is it not successful? And then everyone can learn from that and rectify where necessary. In terms of the climate change bill, the provisions for access to information, in our opinion, they are weak. They provide for information that is provided to the minister to be made publicly available, but in terms of PAPIA and the PAIA Act and the PAPIA Act, which is a far cry from what we'd like to see, which is the proactive disclosure of information. I have a beautiful vision of the state of the climate report being a living document that is available online, accessible, understandable, and there for all to use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. I hope that the audience is getting ready with the questions. May I ask you, MEC, to come to the front, just to share with us what your views are around the performance of provinces in this just transition and how provinces could be tracking their own performance and making their contribution to the national M&A conversation. Thank you very much. And sorry to do this to you, but I know that soldiers are always ready. Thank you.
No, thanks, and greetings to you, a moderator, and your panel, as well as all participants. I think the first is to have a comprehensive plan, which I believe it is in place nationally, a comprehensive framework that seeks to govern or guide the response of the country as a whole. But secondly, as the province, we have been working on the issue of regulating carbon emission. We have developed the greenhouse gas emission inventory in cities such as Durban and Richards Bay, which are more industrialized. And this helps us to be able to measure the transition as to whether we are making progress or not. So technological investment, especially around areas that are more industrialized, is important. And that should be to be able to assess the air pollution that is taking place in the area. The second is to ensure community participation, and I think the previous speaker underlined that point. And in attempt to consolidate community participation, we have established the Provincial Climate Change Council. And this includes the provincial government, the business community, the NGOs, as well as traditional leaders. We are highly supported by institutions of higher learning, such as UKZN and Durban University of Technology. And their participation is quite important because they do have studies that they are conducting, and conducting current studies on environmental degradation and air pollution is quite important. And finally, for us, is how we transit will be important. That will need serious management. We will not be able to undermine what we have with the intention of leapfrogging to something we have not started. So the transition should be just, smooth, which include continue to utilize your material or your material that you have in a way that does not add more problems, but adapt in a way that allow you to skill the employees, create more jobs, and have strong partnership in the process, then resilient. And that's why we are saying platforms such as the International Labour Organization should be drawn to this process, because that's where business, labor, and government at an international level are engaging. But platforms such as Netlec in our case, should also be drawn to participate and have input on a continuous basis. In the province, we have what we call KwaZulu-Natal Economic Growth Coalition. And we are trying to ensure that even the business, we engage them on this process. You will know we're managing two contradictions. You have business on the other side, strong on industrialization. You have NGOs that are strong against air pollution, especially around the South Basin. And we need to bring all of those sectors together to make meaningful contribution. So it will be important to understand that there is no one sector that will succeed and undermine or leave aside other sectors. And for that, we even insist that labor, organized labor, must be made to be part of this just transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MEC. At this point, I want to open the floor. Maybe don't go, say, MEC, if there are questions for you, there are going to be questions for the panel. You can beat me afterwards. For now, let's just. Let me see if we have any questions from the floor for any one of the panel members. And I do know that when you're a panel member and another panel member speaks, you get new ideas of something that you would have liked to say. So I will give you another round to close. Any questions? There's one. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, panel. My name is Melissa Funink. I'm from Natural Justice. What I would just a comment, and if any of the panel wants to respond, that would be great.
Please,
But
closer.
what we would like to see is more emphasis on evaluating the social cost of carbon, particularly associated with specific projects. So we recognize that there's no universally accepted method to evaluate these social costs, and this is often used as an excuse by polluters. So we would like to see some kind of imperative around social costs of carbon being evaluated as part of the rollout of these processes. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Thank you.
My name is Imran Balodia from Wits University. Just two kind of questions to the panel in general. The first is that it seems to me if you're thinking about an M&E framework, maybe a guiding way to think about it is if you don't know where you're going to, then you're going to end up in the wrong place. For us, so the climate question, I think, is moving from the kind of questions of emissions to how we do an economic transition. And it seems to me we need some kind of economic plan for where we're trying to go. Do we have that, and how do you see that being built in? Kind of second thought is I think we are kind of dramatically underestimating the kind of industrial change that is likely to be required. So if you think about much of South Africa's industry, it's kind of actually a kind of flow from Cecil's conversion of coal to energy. So lots of the chains from kind of clothing to plastics, etc., come out of that process. So kind of is the PCC as part of this framework thinking about doing some of that research about these things?
Thank you. We'll take behind Prof here.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Brenda Opilo from Nairobi, Kenya. A question both to you, sir, and also Katie or anybody else from South Africa. So while developing the M&E plan, is there room for incorporating other frameworks that already exist, like the ESG? And what role does it have to play in that? Thank you.
I'll take the last question from Sengwe.
Morning, everyone. Sengwe. Just also from the youth voice, I wanted to say, I think it was great to hear that issues around transparency and accountability. I think as a country, we know there's a lot of corruption and we can't shy away from that. So in the monitoring and evaluation, what systems are you putting in place to ensure that there is, let's be realistic, there's gonna be corruption, but how to ensure that there's less corruption, and how to hold people accountable as well? As also in, yes, what are the systems to continue to track that, and to also track the risks that are gonna that might happen as well as we transition as well? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hlengwe. Let me see, let's start with Katie, just to give overall remarks to some of the questions that have been asked.
Thank you very much for the questions, and also thank you for the panel. I mean, I've been frantically taking notes as you've all been speaking. I think just assembling this group again and again as we refine the M&E framework for the PCC will be incredibly beneficial. So I hope we can count on you for continued collaboration. Just to respond, I mean, I think the thrust of the questions are around the fact that this is an economic imperative, the just transition. We're responding to the climate crisis, but there are significant economic risks that South Africa faces if we do not transition quickly and justly. So to your question about the social costs of carbon, absolutely. This needs to be tracking broader metrics beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. It's really the key pointy edge, I suppose, of our M&E framework, which I guess differentiates it from the more traditional M&E frameworks around climate change, is how are people's lives and livelihoods being impacted by this? What are the costs of the transition, and what are the benefits of the transition? And when you have information that talks to these issues, the case for acting on this is obvious. And what we at the Commission are aiming to do is surface some of these issues, surface some of this information at all levels, at the national level, at the provincial level, and at the community level. And when progress is not going well, our job and within the Presidential Climate Commission is to surface that as well, right? We are an independent body to present this information and do so robustly and do so transparently. And I think to your point on building in the ASGs, right, what's also very clear is that we're going to need a totally innovative approach for this. We need an innovative approach in the just transition, and we've really got to have an innovative approach for tracking the just transition. There is no replicable model. There's no international framework to tell us what this looks like. This is going to be a bottom-up process. I hope South Africa's leadership on M&E, on the just transition, and all this fantastic learning can be crystallized in the way we tackle the just transition as well. Let me move over to other panelists to
Yes.
respond.
Just, I think, let the mic flow.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the questions. I think the social cost question is closely linked to the one on economics, because in Nigeria, the approach we took is to assess the risks, opportunities, and externalities of different energy resources and potential investments. So the energy transition plan, which is part of our JETP program, has an investment pipeline across 4 energy-related sectors. And for each entry into that pipeline, there's an assessment of the risk, opportunities, and the externalities, which is the social cost that she brought up. So I think it's really important to incorporate, and we're trying to do that by externalizing the cost of emissions. Then to the other question on ESG, I totally agree with Katie. I think there's no perfect example, but it's important to look at what is out there, collect feedback, then do consultation on the ground, and then devise something that makes sense in your context. Because these are very context-specific issues. But I really take your point about using some of the ESG standards as a learning or as a guide to then incorporate into local planning. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. The social cost of carbon. I think this is really what drives the transition. If there were no implications of carbon on the ground, we would not be engaged in this process of having a just transition. People's health, their environment, and their cultural and traditional practices that are being disrupted, it's what drives people to be involved in this. So that's part of the social cost. But then underpinning the framework that we have, it's distributive justice. And that is one of the major principles. And that would also, I think, would be an answer to the how do we deal with the social cost or the economic cost of the transition. The South African Constitution has got guides, and in relation to what you were raising around corruption, it's that one of the principles also of having this process, it's transparency, involvement, and everyone should be included. So in case there's such incidences, would use what is provided in the Constitution. For an example, the Public Finance Management Act would also be what would be referring to. There's also a number of regulations and also compliance regulations and acts that also needs to be followed. So in case such happens, because this is a democratic and transparent space, there are institutions that are responsible and they should be alerted so that we don't find ourselves not having a successful transition. The environmental social safeguards are also part of what really needs to happen around compliance. So that's a given, and that is not something that would be overlooked. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me start here. I think we need to recognize that what we're undertaking as a country hasn't been done before, as stated. And with that, we have to accept a certain level of I don't know. And that level of I don't know then puts a lot of pressure on the planning component of the work we're about to do, or rather that we started doing. So I'm not going to take the specific questions. I'll try just answer them broadly, just to say the issues that we've raised, what makes South Africa very, very unique. And if you've engaged with other countries, you will hear that the emphasis that we place on social dialoguing and social partners is probably far greater than anywhere else in the world. The fact that we've got a body that allows for such engagement to take place is quite novel in its case. What that means in real terms is that it creates a space where business comes together, where labor comes together, where communities come together, and government comes together. All of the questions that we're asking are the kinds of questions that when we're now talking about how to implement, it's in that planning phase where all of these questions, then we could begin to look at what kind of metrics can we put in place, what kind of measures, what kind of interventions that make sure that in the execution of what we're trying to do, these particular issues are addressed. We know that the biggest imperative of this just transition is to not try to recreate the injustices that have already happened in the past. The only way we'll be able to do that is to sit through a very rigorous planning process to try and understand how we might be able to address some of those issues as best as possible. The monitoring and evaluation process, as it then later follows, allows for an easier ability to see the changes and the success or failures that we would have been able to achieve in us executing this plan. So I'm quite optimistic that even though it's new and it's novel and we've all got our concerns, if we are honest and I guess following through on this subject of transparency and participation, I think we could be able collectively to sit and begin to answer some of the critical questions that have been asked here, specifically around some of the issues that have been raised around both social and any other issues that we face in our country.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more strongly about the social cost of carbon. 2 days ago, the US EPA revised that number at $200 per ton, which is a lot more than what Treasury is mooting at the level of $30 a ton by 2030. And it's really important to look at that because a lot of high carbon development gets motivated as being economic development. But if we zoom out sufficiently, and for example, weigh up the impact on agriculture and tourism jobs versus jobs in the fossil fuel industry, we get a completely different picture. And I think it's also important to recognize something that Makoma said, which is it's not all of it's economic and quantifiable. What happens to those intangible but very important aspects as well? In terms of Imran's point around where we're going in an economic plan, so I suppose that's the social compact that the PCC is ongoingly creating a space to provide. And that's where so much potential lies. But in a very specific way, one could look at different indicators to GDP, for example. One could look at well-being indicators, indicators around dignity, health, nutrition, and happiness for that matter.
You have closing remarks?
No, thanks. I think there are a few issues that are quite critical. With regard to M&E, I think one, it is important to have a standardized, agreed framework. How do we assess and ensure proper monitoring? And as I said, we have an inventory that we've developed 2 years ago. But secondly, data that comes there must be reliable. Thirdly, we must ensure that on top of that reliability of data, we are holding all partners accountable. So that deals with monitoring. Secondly, or the second question, industrialization, it is clear and we must accept that the history of our country has been based on carbon energy, and therefore we must firstly accept that. The question is whether our just transition will be a transition that is smooth or disruptive. We have a high number of unemployed people, so we must be able to balance and have a proper transition that is well managed. And that's why we encourage the replacement of carbon energy. We've got companies like Avon Park in Kwatukuza, Stenga, that are generating energy, alternative energy. We've earmarked the Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone as a hub for gas, as part of replacing and transition to a green economy. So that is the approach we've taken. And we believe that we must move with the people and don't leave them behind. Thank you. Oh, last point, corruption. It's a very important point. We must deal with corruption at government level, in the private sector, but also in NGOs. And we must not create an impression that it is one sector. It affects all sectors across. NGOs can be corrupt because you find that some NGOs are led by people who are not on the ground. They get funding, they are well resourced, but they are not accountable to anyone. And therefore, we must bring the principle of accountability across the spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To the panel, let me ask that you clap hands for them. Because of time, I'm going to close, to go to closing remarks. Thank you very much. You've made very great contributions. And for me, in the closing remarks, I want to start by telling you a story. Because I think that when you have the PCC and you have the president and you have government and you have people who are visionary, you don't know what could have happened if there was no talk of a just transition. The other day I was at the Egyptian Business Pavilion and the chair of the session actually shared an example of a city that he comes from, where they closed down a power station and all the feeding coal mines just closed down. And that whole system collapsed. And I think that because we are talking about it in South Africa, we are being proactive about it. We want to make sure that we don't have created ghost towns, mines and stations closed and there's no plan. We can't even imagine what could have happened if there was no such conversation. And as I heard that, I felt very proud of being a South African. And I felt very much led to say, you know, we're in a country where somebody is thinking about what could happen if there is no proper plan. And for that, I think it's very useful to see things from that perspective, to say maybe doing a just transition without any guidance that is agreed internationally, you may be less confident, but we should get the confidence from the fact that we've thought about it ahead of time and we are doing something about it now to make sure that we don't have this calamity of this closure everywhere and there's no plan for the people who are working in those sectors and for the economy itself, to say, if there's just closure of power stations and mines, it certainly will affect the economy. I thought I should share that story so that we could be proud of ourselves as a nation. But from this panel, I have taken a few key points, most of which are not new. They are embedded in the Just Transition Framework. Just as a matter of emphasis, inclusivity is key. Nothing for us without us. It's a slogan that has been created and agreed in the Republic. Participation is also key. And as part of those, the participation, information should be available. You shouldn't be participating blindly. You should know what it is that you are participating about and be fully informed to make your own, conclusions around whether this is right or wrong, and make your contribution in that space. Transparency is key. I think it's very clear. The Presidential Climate Commission, the only thing people haven't shared is their bank account information, really. Everything else has been shared. And let me just talk to the benefits of transparency. Accountability, key. If we all know what's on the table and whose hands are on the table, then that is open to everybody to criticize and to make a contribution to. Tracking effectiveness, I think that the key thing here is agreeing what sort of indicators we want to set up in the M&E system and track those indicators and report effectively, so that there's no tracking of indicators and you sit and look at the information, you're happy. It should be shared. Other members of the community should contribute, criticize, and own the information together. Another point I want to emphasize is the opportunities that this transition is bringing. I think we all need to sit and internalize what sort of opportunities exist here, and not look only at, oh, this and this will be closed. What will be opened up? What sort of opportunities exist? And it is a very great opportunity, in my view, to stimulate the economy of South Africa and to make it more inclusive and more people participate in the economy than we have currently. We have a big task, though, Katie, because we have a very huge informal economy in these areas that we need to document so that we can track the improvements. Well, I'm saying improvements because I believe there'll be improvements. I'm not thinking we'll be tracking backwards. And I think it's key to say, Brendan, to say there are still conventional climate change response matters that we need to be talking to. Talking just transition doesn't mean there will be no M&E for greenhouse gas emissions and all of that. It is additional, tracking the whole spectrum of climate action in the Republic. Everyone, MEC, of the actions that are contributing to the just transition must be tracked. And that's why we are on the ground saying, let's agree on the indicators that we want to put in the system, so that when we start receiving information, we all know where this information comes from and whether we're making progress or not. Information, very critical. We all know that in systems, it's garbage in, garbage out. So we want to make sure that the information that we are using to track this transition is accurate, it's reliable, it's relevant. It can be found by anyone. It shouldn't be information that only Thuli has and no one else can verify that information. We should ensure that the information is publicly available, reliable, and verifiable. Lastly, I want to emphasize on local action, participation of communities, and it is very critical. The PCC, for example, is going to be publishing the just transition in different languages in the country, because it's not only for English speakers. People who cannot speak English should read and understand where the country is going with this just transition. We should read and see, are we making the progress that we want to make? And if not, have an opportunity to rectify and make sure that we take ourselves where we want to go. Thank you very much for participating. I have taken 4 more minutes because I know the next event starts at 10:30. So I stole your tea time. Thank you for participating.